might seem ironic to some people to be talking about climate change when it's cold. But of course, most of you probably know better that our cold isn't getting as cold as it used to be. It was 5 below in the Twin Cities this morning. That's pathetic. I laugh in the face of that kind of a cold air. Even International Falls was 36 below, but that's not that cold for them either. And of course, that's one of the things that we're seeing in Minnesota in our changing climate is that frequency of the extremes is becoming way less frequent. In fact, according to the state climatologist, 90% drop in the frequency of the cold extremes, which is 35 below or colder in northern Minnesota, 25 below zero or colder in southern Minnesota. In the Twin Cities, for example, we used to hit 30 below once every few years. So infrequent, but it happened. Anybody know when the last time we hit 30 below in the Twin Cities was? 1996. Yeah. So it's become way less frequent. The pace of change is pretty dramatic. And so, we're talking about all that today. And, what can we all do about it, right? What are some of the solutions? So I want to welcome you to our conversation about Dr. Heidi Roop's new book, The Climate Action Handbook. I'm Sven Sundgaard, meteorologist at Public Radio and Bring Me the News. I'm glad to welcome you to the Great Northern Festival this year. Every year, the Great Northern shares dozens of performances, art installations, outdoor activations, and solutions-focused climate talks during the last week of January and first week of February that invigorate mind and body. We wish to acknowledge the Dakota peoples on whose land we meet, and they took better care of it, and to thank them for their ongoing care of the land and acknowledge their connections to this community and the richness of their culture. On behalf of the Great Northern, I want to thank Climate Series sponsors, the McKnight Foundation, Minneapolis Foundation, Ascot Finlayson, Polestar Minneapolis, and the Carlson Family Foundation for their support of these important conversations, in addition to the many organizations and individuals that contribute to the festival annually. If you'd like to support our ability to bring you this free programming, please consider making a donation on our website, thegreatnorthernfestival.com. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to our special guest. Dr. Heidi Roop is the director of the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership and an assistant professor of climate science and extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. Her research and extension programs combine cutting-edge climate science and effective science communication to increase the use and integration of climate change information and decision-making at a range of scales. From city and state to national and international levels, her climate science research takes her around the world, from Antarctica to California to the shores of Lake Superior. Her recent science communications efforts were focused on her forthcoming book, The Climate Action Handbook, which outlines in a highly visual format everyday solutions that can contribute to the collective and individual climate. Please welcome Dr. Heidi Roop.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this cold. Forget what Sven says. It's cold out there. It's still cold, maybe not as cold as it would be otherwise without our impact. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Great to see new faces and familiar faces. This is the first opportunity I've had to publicly talk about my forthcoming book, my first book. It's a mixed bag of emotions today: nerves, excitement, feeling pretty vulnerable. It's hard to put your heart on a piece of paper and hope that it impacts people. I know it's had an impact on me. So I'm here to talk about the book, and then we're here to be in conversation with you all. And so I'm just going to give you, because we don't have the physical books yet, the book will be available. It's on pre-order now. It'll be available March 21st. I have some visuals from the book. There are over 64 infographics, and almost every action has a pull quote or some sort of visual to help bring the text home. But Sven and I really want to have a conversation together and also with you all, because moving conversation is the way we actually catalyze change. So I'm up here for a variety of reasons, and the clicker is no longer working. Oh, no, there we go. Okay, I'm stealing my own thunder here. So I'm a climate scientist. I've spent over a decade with the great fortune of studying places near and far. I currently still have research projects in Antarctica, where we are basically collecting samples of ice that provide us really unique insights into how Earth's climate system works. And in fact, the ice preserved in Antarctica, the picture of me in the middle is with a big ice core barrel. In that picture, we were sampling ice that was about 135,000 years old. The last time the Earth was as warm as we think it will be in the year 2100. And this ice actually is the reason, one of the many reasons, but one of the most direct reasons why we understand that today and the climate that we are experiencing is so profoundly different from that of natural climate variability and change. Ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica, the ice sheets themselves are time machines. They preserve direct samples of the ancient atmosphere. So between the little arms of snowflakes that we crunch around on out here are air bubbles. And so the atmosphere mixes with the snowpack. And over time on these ice sheets, as that snow gets compressed, that air is actually trapped in bubbles. And we take advantage of the presence of those bubbles because we can sample them. So we can directly sample the composition of the atmosphere 800,000 years ago. And we are working right now to identify a site where we can collect ice that's in a continuous sequence back 1.5 million years, when our interaction with the Earth and Earth's orbit and all sorts of things was very different than today. Again, to provide insights into how the climate system even works, and to then contextualize how profoundly different what we're experiencing today is from the geologic past. So I also spend a lot of time talking about climate change. And the narrative is shifting because we know that facts and figures don't change hearts and minds. And this book was an effort to try to understand the facts and figures, but also think about how do I show up? How do we all show up? How do we welcome more people into thinking that they can engage in solutions to this big challenge that we all experience very differently? So I gave a lot of talks. I pointed a lot of wiggles. I talk about these ice cores. I'm clearly very excited about these little air bubbles that don't probably spin your wheels, but they certainly spin mine. And at the end of every talk, someone inevitably would raise their hand and ask the most logical question of all. Heidi, well, what do I get to do? How do I contribute to solving this huge challenge? I can't decarbonize the electric grid. I can't do all sorts of things that we know are needed at scale. And so I would sort of toe the normal line, and I always felt incomplete at the end of every talk. So even if I was so excited about those bubbles, I just felt flat because I felt like I left myself and the audience hanging. An opportunity was missed. And then in further reflection, I realized that I myself was missing an opportunity to actually walk the walk, to not just understand the problem, which is a big part of my job, and communicate about its urgency, which of course doesn't really get people excited. It makes us want to put our heads in the sand. And so this book is really born out of my own desire to educate myself about how I could show up and how I could welcome others to show up, given that we are all very different capacities, we have very different expertise. I think the Great Northern Festival is a perfect example of how you leverage different perspectives, different expertise, and art and science and community and dance parties and the whole bit to really engage and build community to catalyze change, and catalyze change in whatever way, shape, or form that takes for you as an individual. So I tried to turn this totally befuddled face. This is literally me talking in front of 1,000 people in Seattle, and don't catch me like that. That was a legit photograph. So that was me talking about how space is so big, but also being very confused about space science and why I was there talking about climate science. But nevertheless, I felt that way at the end of every talk, and I give dozens and dozens of talks every year. So what is this book? It's a literal handbook. It will fit in the palm of your hand. My editor just sent me a picture. It does exist in the paper flesh now as of Friday. So there's a physical book available, I promise. It's actually a real thing. And it's highly visual. So it's 100 things, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But the goal was really okay, I'm gonna be really honest. I'm a climate scientist. I love all things climate, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? But I was so exhausted about looking at the stack of amazing books on my bedside table and thinking, I can't bear another chapter, another long format chapter. I deeply care and I want to know, but I just didn't have it in me. And I thought, well, if I don't have it in me, I bet most people don't have it in themselves either to slog through long books. So this is my attempt at trying to provide an entry point, opening a door to exploration, learning, and action for all of us. So the chapters themselves, they're about 300 to 400 words, one page in a small book, paired with a graphic or a pull quote. So they're meant to be, again, this door opening so we can learn and explore and act together. So I tried to figure out, well, 100 things. The 100 things came from Sasquatch Books, the publisher of this book, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I thought, that's a lot. How am I ever going to come up with 100 things? Turns out it wasn't so hard, and there's a lot not in the book. But it spans all sorts of things, from how you start and sustain your engagement and action in this space, from what we eat, how we travel, how we engage in community, how we contribute to being civically engaged and what that can actually look like, from education, communication. And so ultimately what I was really trying to do was open the narrative beyond what I think we typically think about when we think about how to address climate change, and that is reducing our emissions. We, of course, absolutely, no question, have to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere. That's what's causing the problem that we are now trying to solve. But we also have to prepare for the change that we've set in motion. And so the book really seeks to unpack all sorts of ways that we can actually engage that, in addition to reducing our emissions, also help us do a whole range of things, be more cohesive with our communities, think about the multitude of ways that our everyday actions, whether those are emission reductions or other things, can contribute to catalyzing community and response to the climate crisis. So when I think about climate change and what we have to do, there's sort of two sides of the coin. And what a coin together makes a whole, right? So we can't ignore one side or the other of the coin. And I think a lot of our conversation in the climate space has been rightly around mitigation, but the preparation piece of the conversation has really been missing. So the book does very explicitly explore ways we can prevent the problem from getting worse. How we electrify the grid, how we think about our own transportation, what we eat, how we eat it, where it comes from. Those are all part of the story. But so are ways that we can prepare ourselves and our communities to confront the changes we know we've set in motion, so that when we have to weather the storm, we have all the tools in our toolbox to do that, so that we can reduce some of the inequities of climate change, how we can make sure we can show up for and in our communities when we ourselves are experiencing potentially a climate disaster. So things like, you'd never know, checking your insurance policy. Turns out that is a really important individual climate action, because you may not have a rider for the extreme climate event you may be exposed to. And that, of course, is changing. And there might be interesting rules or omissions from your policy. So in the absence of that, your ability to rebound from a climate event is reduced if we don't start thinking about the system and how we respond. So that's just an example of a different way to be thinking about, well, what is a climate action and how can I build a portfolio of work in this space? And so ultimately, the book is really trying to move us from the concept of a carbon footprint to a climate action footprint. What are all the different ways we can show up and engage in solutions? So I'm going to give you a few things, and I try to boil down 5 kind of big core buckets or themes. And I'm going to walk through them relatively quickly so we can get to the conversation part of our time together today. So the first, center action in your strengths and passions. Right? If we're not excited to do what we're doing, we're not going to do it, and we're not going to do it in the long haul. And that is ultimately what the challenge before us requires. Use your energy wisely. Commit to communicate. And this is a favorite action of one of my colleagues, Catherine Hayhoe. Look to the ballot box and beyond. And finally, consider the individual, the community, and the broader collective. So we're going to get started here. So climate change is an all hands on deck situation, and what we shape and create together needs to include a rich diversity of perspectives and approaches. And I think this has become abundantly clear in climate conversations and our broader societal dialogue. We cannot, basically, climate change, as scary as it is and as awful as it already is in many parts of the world, it is affording us a unique opportunity. and one that I really hope we don't miss. It's an opportunity to multi-solve, correct for wrongs, to figure out what is it that we want to create and shape together to move forward. It's offering us an opportunity to innovate, recreate, unlearn, and collaborate in new and different ways that we haven't before. So we have to welcome more people into the conversation, and this book is an attempt to try to show all the different ways that we can honor how different people or where different people are and being able to contribute to solutions. So one of my mentors and colleagues, this is a quote that I have in the book, Dr. Amy Snover, she's the former director of the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group, which was one of the first organizations really seeking to bring university science and climate change information into spaces where it was needed to inform decisions. And so this is a quote that she had in an article as she was departing. She's just retired in July. And it says, no matter what you do or what your skills are, you can have a role in shaping that future and thinking about how we prepare for and reduce climate change. And so I welcome you all to think about what are your strengths and passions and what can you bring to this conversation. Some people are passionate about solar panels, some people not so much. So we need to find what our strengths and passions are and bring those to all of our work in this space. So use your energy wisely. Unsurprisingly, we need to be thinking about how we use energy in a smart way, building efficiency and using new forms of energy, solar energy, wind, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to unpack all of this, but this is one example, and there's a multitude in the books with fascinating statistics about not only cost savings, but things that I had no idea, like top load washers and front load washers are very, very different in terms of the amount of energy they use. A front load washer uses 45% less energy than a top load washer. Energy savings, cost savings. So there's a whole bunch of statistics and other interesting things in there to unpack. And we also have to use all different forms of energy wisely. We have to think about how fast we demand things in our world. Fast shipping is one thing. This was shocking to me. There's a 180% increase in emissions associated with the shortening of delivery time windows for packages. Some of that comes predominantly from inefficiencies that get built in. If you demand a package in an hour or overnight, the shipping company can't actually maximize the route for delivering those goods to you. Whereas if they have 2 days or 3 days or 5 days, they can compile and put packages in a way that enables them to deliver them to all of your neighbors at the same time instead of popping all over town with their yet to be electrified trucks. So there are little things like that, just some patience or some planning can lead to some big impacts. We also have to think about all of our forms of energy. So in the same way that we need to bring our strengths and passions to our work, we have to think about where we are putting our energy. Does anyone have an idea of what these 3 dots represent? Time, good guess. So, pardon? No. Priorities? Almost, we're getting there. So these 3 dots, they're to scale. And the other question I hear besides what can I do is how do I change deniers? How do I make them believe? Well, folks, that big dot, that's the number of adult Americans that are concerned and curious about climate change. That little dot, that's the minority who tend to have a very loud voice, tend to leverage strategic communications in ways that make them seem bigger than they are. But those are the dismissive and deniers that climate change is an issue. So if you're thinking about where do I have an impact, do you focus on that little dot? Or do you think about how to engage that over 70+% of Americans who just want to know and have a safe, trusted conversation with someone with whom they identify, right? Someone in their family, at a workplace, right? That's you, right? You're in this room likely because you're maybe concerned. If you're a denier, we can talk. But I'm probably not going to focus on one person in the room when there's a whole bunch of people who are seeking opportunity to connect, build community, and find information from a trusted source. So I really think we need to use our energy wisely because the conversation is shifting and the tide is turning, and we can't focus on a very small minority when a big majority is just looking for someone to reach out a practical, helping, trustworthy hand. So this leads us to commit to communicate. It can be really scary, but you are the best storyteller about your own story. Nobody can tell your story like you can. So while a majority of us are concerned about climate change, very few of us actually talk about it, and even fewer of us hear about it in the news or from our family and friends. So this is a climate action you can all do cost-free today. You can have a climate conversation with someone in your family, a friend, a coworker tomorrow, and welcome them into your own story about why you care. It's not about all these numbers that I'm showing you and that are in the book. It's about your own, why do you care? It's your story, and you're the only one that's able to tell that story. So look beyond the ballot box. Here's another interesting thing I learned. I'm guilty as charged for this. So we have 537 elected officials in the federal government in the United States. There are over 500,000 elected officials at local levels of government. The amount of energy which we rightly engage in at the federal level, we often are overlooking the opportunity for climate conversations and decision-making and accountability at the local level. That down ballot engagement that doesn't necessarily get the same amount of noise or conversation or attention is so important. Those are the folks who are serving on to determine how much water they're planning for our water facilities. They're making sure we have drinking water. They're managing our schools and our curriculum. All sorts of important places where climate considerations and decisions need to be made, but we're rarely engaging those individuals. So 96.3% of elected officials in this country are at down ballot. They're local leaders. Turns out it means those local leaders, they're easier to access. They often are your neighbors. And they are sometimes easier to talk to because you have a lot in common, because you live in the same place. Probably you care about similar things. And beyond voting, we are rarely picking up the phone, using Twitter, sending an email. So while 70% of registered voters support transitioning our economy from fossil fuels to clean energy by the year 2050, 90% of registered voters have yet to tell or engage their elected official. So this commitment to communicate and looking beyond the ballot box and picking up the phone is a significant opportunity. And in the state of Minnesota, we have an opportunity to pick up the phone right now because there is a bill that's being considered, it just passed the House, to transition our energy economy to 100% clean energy by the year 2040. So if you are interested in that and want to learn more, or you are supportive, this would be an opportunity to call an elected leader, someone in the state elected leader, to voice your support for transitioning our energy economy. So consider the individual, the collective, and the community. So there are a whole range of options in the book that unpack ways that you can consider what you're wearing, the impacts of fast fashion, really interesting, learned a lot about that. If you want to know the per capita shoe consumption globally, never thought I'd look that up. Turns out we have a lot more shoes than most of the world. So just take a glance at your shoe closet and consider that. There are also a whole bunch of opportunities to plan for climate change. So engaging in your community. In fact, Minnesota, the governor in September passed there's the Minnesota Climate Action Framework that was adopted in September. In that framework for the state of Minnesota is a goal to have every community have a climate action plan by the year 2030. Those climate action plans right now start with you. You can be part of that plan. You can be part of shaping and articulating the vision for your community. And increasingly, there are resources available to help communities do that planning. And I know some people in this work, I'm looking at you, have been really engaged in helping not only the state articulate their climate goals, but also their own communities develop their climate goals. So that is a considerable and important way to engage in climate work. And then, of course, with any climate action, there are nuances. This work is hard. I will tell you, it was really hard as a scientist to not want to write 3,000 words about everything in the book. But there are ways when we think about solutions, we have to think about the systems in which those solutions are situated. So as we think about, say, things like reforestation and afforestation and carbon sequestration, we have to be thinking about trade-offs and where are trees planted, where are they maintained, where are they not, where are we making these investments, and at what cost to whom. So there's lots of interesting and important conversations that are happening around, say, buying carbon offsets to plant trees in places that then remove land from food production. That's often smaller scale food production that isn't actually producing a lot of emissions, but is providing vital food sources for communities. So really thinking carefully and reflecting about the complexities and the nuances of solutions and how and where they get deployed is really critical as we think about what we do and how we do it. So with that, we of course need to be mindful of our heads and our hearts as we do this work. As I said, I get to swim in the good, the bad, and the ugly as someone who studies climate change, and it is difficult and terrifying. And so a lot of this work too involves self-care and care of our communities because it can be very emotional. It can be laden with fear. It can sap your hope and sap your energy. And so making sure that you are reflecting and engaging and caring for yourself. I know self-care is like a very buzzy, like often terrible thing. It's not getting a massage, but wouldn't that be nice? But really, this work is deeply personal, and can be deeply painful. And so making sure that we are showing up as our whole and best selves, we can't really do that unless we really reflect upon the impact that what we're experiencing has on us as individuals and our surrounding communities. But also the flip side of that coin, how we feel when there's success and opportunity. So we also need to be looking around us to seeing all of the great work that's being done. And last night, actually, we were fortunate to have an event at the Bell Museum celebrating climate leaders from across the state. So instead of focusing on what's not being done, had an amazing celebration of individuals and communities and collective groups that are catalyzing change, often against all odds. And so we also need to be thinking about the ways in which we celebrate success, even if it feels small and incremental. And so with that, I think the last action in the book is gratitude and celebrating success. And so I'm going to transition to a conversation with Sven by just thanking you all again for being here today, for engaging in this climate action, for engaging in the climate actions that you already do. I saw a lot of nodding and smiling. And I know many of you are leaders, and I have been privileged to learn from folks on this call, Sadie, and the folks here in this room. There's some amazing folks in this room. I appreciate you coming out to support this conversation and engage in the conversation that will follow now. And of course, welcome you to consider the book or picking the book up at your local library, asking your librarian to carry the book, because that in fact is a very climate conscious way to go. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And Sven, I'll welcome you to the stage so we can have all the hard questions now.
It's not too hard though.
Oh, I don't know. I hear you on the radio. You throw Kathy Where's are those curveballs all the time.
Well, she throws them to me sometimes.
That's true, but that's her
People don't
job.
realize
Isn't
that
it?
if she asks me a question, sometimes it's totally unscripted, and got to be on my toes early in the morning. All right. Well, luckily, yeah, I don't think we have many people in that little dark circle in this room here, right? I think
I don't know.
I think they're mostly on Twitter.
Great. Well, you can turn that off.
Yeah. I'm really glad that in your intro you talked about how you learned a lot too, and how, that not every person who understands climate and meteorology has all the answers and solutions too, because I think that's helpful for the general public, of course, who feel even more overwhelmed by all this. So it does sound like, the book was a product of a personal journey for you to understand more about climate solutions. What surprised you the most as you were deciding what 100 actions to include? And I know you said you thought it'd be hard to identify 100. You could have actually done more, but describe that process.
There was a lot of looking at a blank sheet of paper.
Writer's block.
Yes, writer's block. Nothing like a deadline. The process, I think a lot of it was sort of looking around my world and sort of thinking about how I was moving through the world and where there might be unexpected opportunities to learn. Does this have an impact? That word is actually really fraught for me. And I should do a control F and find it in the book, because how we define impact, that was a really difficult thing as I went through and thought about what do you include, and how do you put it in a succinct format. The word impact is actually very nuanced and very personal. When you think about how you show up. So there's the impact of, let's just give an example that is probably familiar for most people, is right, dietary changes, right? Reducing your consumption of red meat, for example, or meat products writ large. There's a big emission savings there. But is that the impact you want to have? Or maybe there's a way, and as it, said, sort of developing this concept of the climate action footprint, really came from this idea of like, what is an impact to whom? How do you quantify it? And some of the things are very unquantifiable. And so that process was, it was difficult. And then it was trying to balance, finding ways to welcome as many people as possible to find one thing that either surprised them or inspired them or welcomed them into a space or a conversation that they maybe had never been welcomed into before. And so it was that. And then also I'm very biased in my role at the University of Minnesota. I focus on how we prepare communities and individuals and our broader systems to withstand the impacts of climate change. And so I really wanted to reflect on what does preparedness look like? Not just how do we prevent the problem from getting worse, but can we broaden the conversation into not just the emissions space, but also the sort of resilience space, and what does that look like? And then again, how do you define impact? So that it was a lot of winnowing, cutting, organizing, binning, unbinning, rebinning. And thankfully I had an amazing editor, Jen Warwick, who ultimately helped me make really difficult decisions. But she was the audience for the book. So she was great. The things she got surprised about, like cloud storage and, like it's again, impact small on the emissions front, but like servers and cloud, the cloud computing, all of this takes a ton of energy that we don't necessarily think about, those 7 email accounts that we have and those 15 million emails that remain undeleted that you're never going to look at again. There's energy associated with all of that. And so she would go on lots of dates. She would tell me, she lives in Seattle, and talk about that. And I was like, Jen, this is why you don't have second dates. Don't talk about that. It's like the folks from Microsoft don't want to hear about that. But she really helped me cull and find things that others found interesting, right? Can be a very lonely process trying to create something when I only have my lived experiences and my perspective. And so it was helpful to get input from others on what was interesting or not.
Well, in case people don't know, your spouse is also in climate science, so it's not like you have a totally generic audience to bounce off.
It's true. We're a really fun household. A glaciologist and a climate scientist. It's, dinners are really rosy.
Why did you opt for such a short text and visual format for the book? Are you missing some of the nuances and complexities of the science in this format?
Yeah, great question. So yes, I'm sure that's where all the Twitter hate is right now. I'm just teasing. It's really hard. And I'll give you an example. There were tears shed this week. As I said, this is like very emotional. It's very fraught because I am a scientist and I want to include all the facts and figures. And I wanted to look at all the literature. There were over 812 footnotes in the first version of this book, right? Every 300 words had about, on average, 14 citations. Right. I know. They were like, wait, how do we handle that? I was like, you need every citation in the book. So there is, again, this is 300 words, so there are trade-offs. And ultimately, again, these were entry points. It's providing a range of different sources of information, from peer-reviewed papers, which are like very comforting to me, right, to government-issued websites and other things, so that people could access information and explore, sort of deepen their knowledge in a specific area that became of interest, right? So that 300 words, it's what fit on a page for the format of the book that my publisher told me was all you get. So that, that dictated that too. But again, also born out of this idea that most of us don't especially for a topic that's challenging, don't necessarily want to sit down and read 3,000 pages about carbon capture and storage, but you might want the 300 to 500 word. I think that's a two-page spread. That was a hard one. You might want the primer. You might want to just know, what is it? How do I engage? Is there a role for individuals here? And where do I learn more? And so the idea of pairing the visual with short text was really to be more welcoming and to encourage more people to really think and broaden and have an opportunity to look at, again, those emissions, to the prevention and preparedness piece. And it is a handbook, so it's like it fits in the palm of your hand. And I also wanted something that you didn't have to sit down and commit to reading from front to back, that you couldn't understand it if you didn't start at the beginning, but you flipped open in the middle. You can read this in any order and hopefully see something of interest. And so that was really, it was to do something different and maybe get more people thinking deeply about the opportunity that they have.
What I'm excited to see the actual book. You know, we talked about
Me too.
doing this last week, and I'm like, well, can I see it? And she's like, well, no, nobody has it right yet. But just the examples are great. And, you know, kind of like you talked about, especially, you know, in our fields, we read all the in-depth stuff all the time anyways. And I'm sure they look like a very smart group of people out here. I can tell.
I mean, how many Minnesotans are in the room? Because then it goes without saying.
Yeah.
I mean,
and so
I'm from Wisconsin, so.
This book is separate. What are we saying? This book is separate from, you know, what's climate change. You know, you can go somewhere else for that. But I really like this. And I love the graphics, just the few you showed me and then the few you had today, because I can see this being used in schools and other things. So I think it's really good that you're separating out that this is an action handbook versus, you know, climate change.
The compendium on all things climate. Yeah.
You talk about climate action, footprint instead of a carbon footprint. Can you help us better understand what you mean by that? Shouldn't we be prioritizing actions that have the biggest impact? There's that word again.
Yep.
As far as emission reductions.
Yeah, and so I think I touched on this a little bit already. That is the hard thing, and I think that's where some expectations might not be met for the content of the book, because I think people really want to be able to say, like, I've reduced my carbon footprint by this many tons of carbon over this amount of time. And while I think that is important, I also, even though I'm a scientist, I find a lot of the units, and I really did struggle in translating the units into meaningful things. So we talk about gigatons and megatons of carbon, like, what does that even mean? Like, you can draw like a box and say you can put this much carbon in that box, but I think that we miss people when even though that is profoundly what we need to do, right? Look, I am not in disagreement that we need to we actually need to stop producing emissions, and we actually have to take it out of the atmosphere. Like, we're in a situation where we got to do both of those things. The science is abundantly clear, but the science is also abundantly clear that we need to reduce emissions, but we also have to prepare. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change very clearly, even in the last year, came out with an assessment on adaptation and resilience. So adaptation is basically preparedness. And if we don't do that, the way we experience climate change is going to be even worse than it already is, right? We know we've set change in motion. For some things, there's only one direction of change. And so as we think, like sea level rise, it is going up for at least 1,500 years. Just that is the state of the climate system. How fast and how much? That's a big open question. That's why we go to Antarctica. But in that, I think we lose people. And so the idea of the climate action footprint was saying, well, I don't know that I can like reverse sea level rise because you just told me I can't. So like, I'm going to go do something else. I'm going to read a different book.
I'm going to get a cheeseburger.
Yeah, I'm going to go have a cheeseburger. With some duck fat fries. That sounds good, doesn't it? But
you can still do that.
You can still do that, right? And so this is the other piece, right? This is why a climate action footprint, because it isn't all about what we give up and how much we sacrifice, and that being the badge we wear that we're so proud of, right? Because that, again, it alienates people, it others. There are only a certain amount of population that can actually do a lot of the things that amount to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, right? Electric vehicles, those aren't yet accessible to everybody. Solar panels doesn't work everywhere. Does that mean that if you have the capacity to do that, you shouldn't? No, right? That is part of your portfolio of your climate action. That's your climate action footprint, but we don't all have to look the same, right? We all have different sized feet and we like different shoes. We have a lot of them here in the US, of course, relative to everybody else. So, right, we have a lot of opportunity to fill those shoes with all sorts of actions that resonate with the ways that we walk through the world and who we walk through the world with. And so the idea of the climate action footprint, I think, is really to encourage people to think more broadly around what is the impact that they can have, and what is the impact they want to have, and in what ways. Because art and science and working and engaging in community and deepening dialogue, these are all climate actions, and I think we just are not calling them that. And I think we need to also give ourselves sort of I'm someone who likes checklists and numbers. So like for me, I'm drawing like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Like I want to see all that I'm doing and the ways that I'm thinking deeply about my impact on the world, right? And that isn't just how much green gases I produce or reduce. It's about the ways that I contribute holistically to thinking about how we embrace this opportunity that climate change is affording us, even as awful as it is. And that requires more than thinking about just emissions.
Your book includes chapters on art, as you just mentioned, mental health, recreation, land use, fees, and other activities not traditionally thought of as climate action. Can you tell us more about those topics and how they're connected to climate change and climate action? The user fees thing I found interesting in particular.
Yeah. And actually that chapter, so like, again, I think I'm just sort of repeating myself here. There's just an abundance, right? I think we often talk about climate action as being the thing we give up. And this is really an opportunity to think about how do we show up as our whole selves? How do we add to what we do? How do we think about new hobbies and the ways in which what we do and how we recreate are actually climate actions? So the land use fees is actually born out of the idea in the long list of things as I was going through my list of things I thought was interesting. That one stayed, was actually in Washington State, had the opportunity to work on climate planning with the State Department of Natural Resources. And they were talking about, well, how do we plan for climate change? How are we going to address this? How are we going to afford to prepare our parks and our green spaces and our recreational lands for climate change? And one of the big things was that a majority of the money they use to maintain campgrounds, to keep roads cleared, to provide porta potties, to enable snow machines and skiing and hiking and camping in the summer, that all came from land use fees in the winter. So there was a big problem as there was less snow and it was further up. There were all sorts of things like bears tipping over porta potties before they could remove them. And that's actually very costly, it turns out. So they need people to pay the user fees in the winter. Like the snow is the way they pay for all the other recreation the rest of the year. And so it got my wheels spinning like, that's interesting. So paying your user fees, and this is true for conservation broadly in our public lands, those user fees that we pay actually go in, there's significant millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars that go into conservation and preservation of our natural lands. And so in many ways, if you avoid that fee, right, especially in certain states where they are reliant, they cannot provide those services or preserve those green spaces in the absence of the user fees. So like the snowmobilers are a critical part of the ecosystem for all of parks and recreation, basically in the state of Washington. And if you remove that, what happens? And so it's those types of things, thinking like, what are the ways that I show up? And that is one probably unexpected way that many of us are contributing to climate solutions in our own backyard through things we love to do, like play outside. I like to be outside. Maybe not on a cold day like this. Sven.
Oh, it's like 7 now above. Come on. I'm going to go for a run later in this. Do individual actions really matter given the scale of the change needed? I think this is the thing that everybody struggles with every day.
Yes, they do. Every action matters, and individuals make up the collective. So if we choose as individuals not to act, then how is the system change going to occur? Because if we are going to ask an individual legislator or someone to act, they may have different authority to make decisions or have influence. But again, a lot of those decisions are made by individuals and they represent a collective. And so I think as we think about systems change, there's no question we have to change systems, but systems are made up of individuals. And so in the absence of us showing up and engaging and considering our individuals, our communities, and the collective, I think we miss an opportunity. So I am of the camp that yes, action, collective action at scale is the way we actually achieve our very ambitious targets to reduce global average temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're unlikely to do that, but we have a greater chance of doing that if we all pitch in and we influence the systems that we can. So I think, and again, every action matters. That was actually the original title of the book. I said something silly on a panel like this, which is how this book was born. I said something like every action matters. And then they said, well, come tell me more about that. And I thought, uh-oh, I'm in trouble now. So yes, I am a firm believer that individuals, as long as we consider our collective, those actions do matter.
And this isn't an all hands on deck thing. And I like that because Dr. Jane Goodall, who I had the opportunity to meet once, says the same thing. She's like, one person, you know, and you tell two more people, and now he becomes 50, which can become 500. And all of a sudden you're talking about millions. It does make an impact.
And we see that bear out like with solar panels. There's all sorts of fun stories of Californians envying their neighbors, thinking, what's that on your roof there, Fred? And then Fred tells Jane, you know, these solar panels. And then before you know it, Jane's got a bigger set of solar panels. So we know that those conversations and doing and showing and sharing lead to that action at scale.
Yeah, I know at the Minneapolis Foundation, one of the projects they're funding is solar panels in North Minneapolis, and this gets into kind of the equity issue. And I never thought of it before, but they said, you know, just having them visible in certain neighborhoods makes an impact. Because like you said, then Jane wants one and everybody else. And that collective action is just really cool to see. How can we address here we go, the partisan nature of climate change? And this has always bugged me, how it became a partisan issue, because like Richard Nixon, for example, would be a hippie today. Relatively speaking.
Well, I don't have all the answers, and that's a whole book in and of itself. Yeah. And the history of the politics of climate change is very interesting, and there are books out there. Work by Naomi Oreskes is particularly interesting, I find, and there's a person to follow on Twitter if you aren't familiar with her work. And there's lots in that space, but I think I don't have the answer, but I'm going to share an experience, a recent experience, actually. So we think about climate change as a partisan topic. It remains so. But the conversation is shifting. So I recently had to testify in front of the state legislature. And often there are very hard questions, good questions, hard questions too. And the conversation, I had a slide up that said something like, climate change needs no passport. Meaning we certainly need to think about what we do as a state and the way that we are preparing as a state and reducing our emissions. But we, of course, our state is a political boundary. It doesn't determine all that we experience or the costs or consequences of climate change, because it turns out for Minnesotans, for example, if you're in the agricultural industry, if there's a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, that's a problem because most of our fertilizer comes from the Gulf of Mexico, and we had some of the highest fertilizer prices in about a decade because a hurricane wiped out facilities. And we know that hurricane was worse because of a warmer planet, because of greenhouse gases produced by humans. So the point being, there was agreement on both sides of the aisle that climate change really does need no passport, and it is happening, and it's real, and it's costly. And the conversation is no longer about whether climate change is real or I'm there because I want to fund some vacation to Bora Bora with my luxurious salary because I'm there just, touting a hoax. It was about a disagreement around what solutions work best in different parts of the state and for different populations of people. And that is a much better place to be. We may disagree, and there may be politics embedded in some of the conversations that we're having around mineral extraction and rare earth elements and the extent to which you can extract those from U.S. sources or overseas, and a lot of the equity issues embedded in there. But it's a different conversation now. And I think that there is a lot more opportunity to have practical, yes, partisan, but I think forward-looking, action-oriented conversations that really are going to help us make more progress. So I see hope in the reframing or different thinking. Again, it's still very partisan. It's partisan in our state, but again, the concerns are, I think, emerging more around what we do, not whether the house is on fire. We're all agreeing. We're just deciding now, what is it, a garden hose we use, or is it like the fire truck hose? So I think I'd rather be there than like turning my back on a house on fire.
What is the one thing you wish everyone knew about climate change or climate action? Now we reduced it from 100 to one thing.
I know. Did I write that question?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, that was foolish.
Just one.
I think the one thing I wish everyone knew is that, and this is maybe, in a room like this, you all chose to be here, not like students, captive audience. They maybe didn't choose to be there, but they have to be there.
I paid for it.
That's true. They're there for my Bora Bora vacation, right?
That's right. How is Bora Bora?
Never been. Can't afford it. The one thing I wish everyone knew, I guess, is that I think I've said this repeatedly today, and it really is that I think there's an opportunity to reframe and think about our abundance and the opportunities we have rather than all that's at risk and all that's at stake and all that we're going to lose. Because if we continue to use that narrative to drive our work, it's just not going to happen at the pace and scale in the way that it needs to. And so I invite you all to think about what you can create or what we can create together if we choose to act, and if we choose to act in the myriad ways that are possible to all of us as individuals, and what that looks like, right? That climate action footprint, it's unique to us. We just have to choose to put one step in front of the other and look around us and find someone to walk with us. So I welcome you all to walk towards a better, brighter future that you get to help create.
Now we're getting the 10-minute. Does that include audience questions then? So we have 2 more questions on here, but should we take audience questions?
Let's go to the hard questions.
The hard questions. Who's got a hard question?
Got
Yes,
one
sir.
over here. Oh boy, all
get a
right. I
choice.
like this.
Greenwashing. So how do we all not succumb to greenwashing as we try and take actions? Or how do you see the overlap between climate action and climate justice so that we're not accidentally creating more injustice through the climate actions that we choose to take?
Great. So maybe I can do both. There's a chapter on greenwashing, so you should get the book. Look at that. My editor is going to be so proud of me. But yes, right. This is a big problem. I mean, sort of alluded to this, right? We've got a lot of companies making a lot of what we're increasingly learning are idle commitments. And they are actually creating a lot of continuing and perpetuating injustices or creating new ones by lulling us into a sense of climate accomplishment because we are buying offsets that maybe don't work or have no third-party verification or lack a whole bunch of structure that you would otherwise be believed to be thinking are in place. So greenwashing, right? Unfortunately, this is true with disinformation and misinformation, which are also rampant in the climate space, is that we as individuals have to take on the burden of being savvy consumers. And there are some tips and tricks outlined in a visual and in the book on how to spot greenwashing. And I think the one advice I would give for folks, I don't know if anyone's on Twitter anymore, but is just to take a deep breath before you share or repost, because it often, I get emails from my uncle like, whoops, he's a very, very brilliant man who sometimes spreads misinformation via email and online because it's like almost too good to be true. And so a lot of that is about being a savvy consumer and having a critical eye. I'd say right now for like every climate commitment you see coming from a corporation. And there are actually some websites and other things I linked to, some tools. There are researchers evaluating commitments and claims and companies, and they give them gradings for different types of like consumer choices that you might be making. And so greenwashing is a thing and we all need to beware, and that is an individual climate action. So there I picked one of 2. There, yeah.
Hi, my question is a question and then a plug. What was the blue dot on your one slide?
Yeah, we didn't say the blue one.
You had a large circle and a very small circle. There was a middle circle. What was that? That's the question. The plug is regarding action. In the last hour, for those that were here, we heard about MN 350's climate equity plan for the city of Minneapolis. If you live in Minneapolis, the next few months are critical. You can talk to your council, your city council person, member. Get involved, get on, MN 350. It's easy to find online. Or if you have questions, I'm on one of the board teams. I could maybe share some information. So what's the blue dot?
Yeah, the middle dot. Thank you. Those are the dismissive So there's the deniers, and then there's the dismissive, and then there's everybody else. So it's over 80% of adult Americans are curious and want to know more, and again, are just looking for a trusted place to have that conversation. So, yep, opportunity abounds.
How do we choose? Oh, 3 questions.
You get to
Oh.
choose.
And we got 5 minutes, so they better be good ones.
Thank you for this. You mentioned the communications and the urgency can make it feel overwhelming and make you want to put your head in the sand. So, of the 100 actions, what do you think is the easiest, most accessible to do?
Of 100, remember, you got to choose one.
I know, like going through the list, I've looked at it many more times, the table of contents more times than I care to admit. You know, I think, quite frankly, it is the communication one. It's top of mind. I think there are many, but it's no cost. And we know it has a real impact. So the science of science communication and climate change communication researchers show very clearly that having a conversation, showing up as an individual, again, I think one of the big problems with climate communication to date has been that it's like people like me are being expected to communicate and be the voice of change. And like, that's just a really bad idea. I mean, the book, yes, but I had to learn too, right? We don't know all the answers. I can tell you a lot about the physics of greenhouse gases, but like most people, again, you don't, or you, I can tell you a lot about ice cores. You might be excited about that, but most people are not excited about that. They mostly want to know if I sleep into 10 and how I go to the bathroom. So they don't really care about the science. And so I
Have
think,
you been
right.
attacked by a penguin?
No. Polar bears in the Arctic, another story. But it is about telling that story and showing up as a human and why we care. And that is something that I think most of you probably don't have to reflect very deeply on. Why do you care about this issue? What's at stake? Why does it matter to you? That is an opportunity. You can even have that with someone who's in that big dot, or maybe someone that you know is already totally committed to climate change. But, you know, I've had this journey of learning the abundance of things that we can do, the myriad actions we can take. And that is one that we can do again and again and again, and can feel relatively confident that those conversations and our stories are engaging people and possibly inspiring someone else to do something. And that is, you know, getting many more hands on the boulder, pushing it uphill. And before we know it, we'll be there reaching our goals. So that's the first that comes to mind.
We got 2 minutes. I think we should squeeze in. The gentleman in the very back, I know, had his hand up first before, so there's our microphone. Yeah.
You can ask Sven a hard question too. He's
I'll,
fair game.
I'll stick with you. Sorry.
Okay.
You spent a lot of time thinking about the very far past, and with this book, thinking about kind of the present and the future. Can you paint a picture for us of what 2060 looks like? The 2060 that you want?
Oh, that's great. I just tried to do this for the legislature and I got a lot of like, huh? So I'm going to try again. This is great. Thank you for round 2.
But they look like that a lot of the time, to be
No.
fair. If you ever watch the feed,
It's riveting TV, let me tell you. I think that for me, and I'm going to contextualize it in this geography that we're sharing right now, because I think it would change based on where I was in space or time. So for me today, what that looks like is a state that is in a geography and communities that are prepared to provide their children with a quality education, to engage them in a way that they want to live here and die here, because they have all of the services and the things that humans deserve, no matter who you are, where you live, the color of your skin, your identity, right? That we have chosen to take this threat and this crisis as real as it is, and that we will be experiencing in 2060. But we have the tools and the resources and the social cohesion and the social capital to actually confront those changes and say that was hard, but we were ready. And we still have jobs, and we can still go to school, and we can still, or we can get people food and provide basic services and provide people with their base needs and human dignity And I think climate change is challenging our abilities to do that. There are structural systems in place that prevent us from doing that. And this is an opportunity that we could use to break down those walls and really shape a community and a society that we are all proud to be in, and where we feel like, you know what, that was worth it. That hard work, that maybe giving up the seat at the table or opening the seat at the table to new voices and perspectives that are just so essential to shaping that future. We did it. We maybe didn't get it totally right, but we weathered the storm, and we also created a world where we didn't exceed 3 degrees Fahrenheit warmer global average temperature, and knew that there were going to be millions of more people exposed to drought and water scarcity every month. And we can look back and say, you know what, that was hard, but it was worth it. And look what we created.
I think that's a great way to end this. Thank you so much. Get the book. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us. And are you going to be around if people have
Yeah.
questions?
Yeah.
We just want to be mindful of everyone's time. So
Yeah. Thank you so much.
thanks for coming, everybody.